On a damp March morning in 2026, the line at the Fowler Grain and Feed scale house stretched past the fertilizer tanks, and every driver had the same glance when Bo Sutton rolled in last. His 1996 Chevrolet C2500 coughed once, settled, then idled with the patient rattle of an old machine that had outlived predictions. Rust had eaten through both rocker panels. The tailgate was held by 2 loops of baling twine. The odometer read 312,044 miles, though nobody believed it was the first time it had passed 300,000. Bo stepped out in patched brown overalls and a faded cap with a seed corn logo that had not existed for 15 years, fed 4 quarters and a dime into the coffee machine, and waited while 2 younger operators in pressed jackets discussed drone mapping subscriptions and annual lease rates. From 10 feet away, he looked like a man 1 injector failure from retirement. That was the consensus in places like this. Quick eyes, quick sorting. Travis Keene, who had come to the elevator to greet prospective buyers before a dealership field demo, watched Bo count his coins and smiled the kind of smile salesmen use when they have already sorted a room into targets and non-targets. Travis wore clean tan boots that had never carried mud into a machine shed, a black quarter-zip with embroidered dealership logo, and a new 3/4-ton diesel with dealer plates and a sticker price of $84,900 in the side window. He shook hands with everyone except Bo. What nobody in that parking lot saw was the balance sheet folded in Bo's coat pocket from the previous night's reconciliation. 1,140 acres owned free and clear, 620 acres cash rented, in on annual agreements, commodity inventory hedged in thirds, and personal net worth at current Benton County and Warren County land comps of $8,460,000. None of it showed in the truck. None of it showed in the overalls. That was the point. By the first week of April, Claire Sutton was back from Bloomington with an MBA, a laptop full of clean dashboards, and the warm confidence she carried when she talked through models at the kitchen table. She was 31, precise, and not arrogant in the crude sense. She had worked hard for the degree. She knew weighted average cost of capital, debt tax shields, and growth sequencing. She laid out printouts and timelines and talked about the next 20 years, about scale, about leverage, about staying competitive before consolidation, made choices for them. Bo listened. He always listened first. Bo had not started with hidden wealth. He had started with a front-row seat to what debt could do when weather and rates moved in the same direction. In 1979, he was 25 and working for his father on 240 acres of mixed corn and soybeans near Earl Park. Land values were climbing, lenders were optimistic, and every coffee counter in the county told the same story. Borrow now, buy now, inflation will erase the loan. His father signed for 320 additional acres at $2,180 per acre with a variable note that reset twice a year. The first rate was 9.4%. By late 1981, it was above 16%. By the spring of 1982, the payment schedule had gone from difficult to predatory. Not because anybody lied on paper, but because paper had assumed stability and the world delivered volatility. Bo remembered the day of the meeting at Citizens State Bank in detail down to the fluorescent hum. His father's monthly obligation on land and machinery had crossed $9,700. Grain checks were lower than projected. Operating notes rolled forward. The banker was not cruel. He was direct. Sell acres or miss the line renewal. Over the next 14 months, the family sold machinery first, then 80 acres, then another 60 at a discount to a neighbor with cash. They survived. But his father's shoulders changed shape in that period, as if worry had literal weight. Bo decided then that debt itself was not evil, but fixed payments bigger than bad years were fatal. He rented his first 40 acres in 1983 at $82 per acre, cash rent, and planted with a used 6-row planter he bought for $1,350 from a retiring farmer near Oxford. He financed nothing long-term. He worked nights welding for a fabrication shop in Lafayette at $7.25 an hour, 48 hours most weeks in winter, and every dollar after household bills went to 2 envelopes marked taxes and opportunity. In 1984, corn averaged $2.55 per bushel, and his net, after all variable costs on his own acres, was thin, but he had no equipment payment due in January. That detail mattered more than pride. From 1985 through 1993, his records read like cautious arithmetic rather than ambition theater. 1985, rented 80 more acres, bought a 1968 John Deere 4020 for $8,900 cash. Repair parts, $740. 1987, federal land auction after a foreclosure, bought 120 acres at $1,850 per acre, total $222,000, down payment $88,000 from savings, balance cleared in 34 months, no refinance. 1989, replaced combine with a used 7720, bought at bankruptcy sale for $24,600, put in $5,400 over 2 years of repairs, still less than 1/3 of new list price. 1992, bought adjacent 160 acres at $2,400 per acre, total $384,000, paid in 4 annual installments, each backed by grain inventory before paperwork was signed. 1993, no new land, rebuilt working capital, held $96,000 liquid through harvest. He was not anti-technology. He was anti-obligation without margin for error. That was the distinction he kept trying to hand Claire across the table. In classroom models, volatility was a parameter. On farms, volatility was the baseline reality, and sequence mattered more than average. A profitable 10-year projection could still fail in year 2 if payments were fixed and losses arrived early. Bo had watched good operators disappear because their timing was bad, not because their character was weak. He also kept life costs stubbornly low, not as performance, but as structural advantage. The farmhouse had been paid off since 1998. Property taxes and insurance averaged $14,900 annually by 2026. Family living draw stayed near $68,400 even after inflation because they cooked at home, drove old vehicles, and avoided status purchases that became permanent overhead. Clothing budget one year was $620. Medical out-of-pocket was the line he never argued with. He spent where outcomes mattered, saved where image demanded spending. By mid-May, Claire had heard enough stories to start asking different questions, tracing years instead of quarters, obligations instead of gross return. She still came back to growth curves and expansion windows. The friction between them was not disrespect. It was framework conflict, and Bo could hear it in the nouns each of them kept choosing. She talked expected conditions. He talked clustered bad conditions. She talked optimization. He talked survivability. Both sets of math worked until the weather, basis, and rates stopped taking turns. That month, Bo took her to a farm auction outside Attica at 6 in the morning, not for nostalgia, but for method. Rain had turned the lane into heavy clay. Dealers stood in clean trucks near the road. Working farmers stood by the machinery with coffee in foam cups, looking under shields and checking bearings with gloved hands. Bo had a folded sheet in his pocket with 3 columns: replacement value, probable repair envelope, and walk-away ceiling. He did not bid until noon. He bought a 12-row planter toolbar for $18,500 and a grain cart for $27,000. Expected repairs were $6,800 total. Equivalent new package from a dealer lot was $211,000 before interest. He paid by cashier check that afternoon. At home, he showed Claire the maintenance routine that made old equipment act younger than its age. Every machine had a binder with hours, grease intervals, bearing replacements, chain measurements, and preseason inspections dated and signed. Deferred maintenance, he told her in 8 quiet words, was just debt-wearing coveralls. The logic was simple and ruthless. Spend $3,200 in winter to avoid $32,000 in-season panic purchases. Cash flow loved prevention. 3 days later, she sat at the kitchen table with him and reconciled 10 years of entries against bank statements. There were no mystery jumps, no hidden partner, no miracle lease. There was disciplined spread between what the farm could earn in a bad year and what it was obligated to pay no matter what. That spread had purchased time, and time had purchased land when others had to sell. When Travis Keene arrived that Friday with a leather folder and a bright pen, he found Claire prepared, Bo polite, and the old oak table cleared, except for ledgers stacked by decade. Travis opened with urgency and confidence, speaking in smooth totals and market share. Bo let him finish, nodded once, and slid the first ledger toward his daughter. "Give me 1 month," he said. "I will show payment survivability." Travis tapped the leather folder with one finger, glanced through the window at the Chevrolet with baling twine on the tailgate, and treated Bo's request like a sentimental delay. He was still standing in his clean quarter-zip, truck key clipped to his belt, dealership logo bright on his chest, the posture of a man who sold urgency for a living. 1 month costs you position, he said to Claire, not Bo. The holdback is $75,000. Non-refundable. 10 days. Bo stayed seated. Claire watched him reach for his glasses, unfold them, and lay them beside a ledger dated 1986 to 1994. No raised voice, no speech, just a yellowed page and a line item written in blue ink. Interest paid this year, 0. Travis smiled again, thin this time. With respect, this is why smaller operators plateau. Serious growth takes structure. Bo looked at Claire and answered in a tone that did not compete with anyone. If the structure cannot survive bad years in a row, it is not growth. It is timing risk wearing a suit. The room quieted. Travis gathered his pages more sharply than he had opened them. At the top sheet, printed in full color, the new expansion package still looked clean and convincing. Total financed build-out, $3,280,000. Variable rate start 8.35%. Annual debt service, $400 to $12,900 before labor, insurance, and family draw. The numbers were polished. The assumptions were kind. He left with a final nod at Claire, as if the serious conversation could resume once nostalgia cleared out of the way. Gravel snapped under his tires as the dealership pickup pulled out. Bo waited until the sound faded, then opened the first ledger and slid it to the center of the table. Before this goes any further, if you want to see what happens when clean projections meet dirty weather, stay with this one. Claire sat back down, laptop open, and Bo began the lesson where his own certainty had been broken and rebuilt. He did not start with philosophy. He started with sequence. He pointed to 1998. Corn was not the problem that year. Hogs were. Market hog losses averaged $118 per head over 2 cycles. On 1,040 head finish, that was a negative $122,720 before counting wear, hauling, or borrowed time. 2 neighbors who were better livestock men than Bo had expanded 3 years earlier with low teaser rates and aggressive volume assumptions. One carried fixed barn and equipment payments of $16,400 per month. The other carried $11,900. Both had respectable, long-run return models. Both hit the same 12-month window of weak prices and rising feed cost. One sold out by February. The second made it to July, then auctioned feeders and shut the barns. Not bad men, Bo said. Bad sequence. Claire typed without looking up. Bo continued, page by page, line by line, linking each handwritten entry to matching bank records in a cardboard file that smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. 2001, a wet spring delayed planting 14 days, then an early frost-cut test weight discounts into cash flow. 2005, diesel jumped enough to add $19.40 per acre across fieldwork and haul. 2009, basis blew out during harvest and widened cash strain despite decent yields. 2012, drought drove his corn to 108 bushels per acre on ground that usually carried 182 to 196 with the normal rain. Insurance softened the impact, but not fast enough to match fertilizer timing if he had carried large term payments. He stopped at a loose sheet clipped into 2012 and let Claire read it. If fixed debt service had been above $240,000 this year, operating line renewal would have required collateral sale. She looked up and asked, "You were stress testing this in real time?" "Every winter," he said. By the 3rd week of June, the table looked like a small county archive. Ledgers by decade, input invoices stacked by crop year, tax returns with flags marking depreciation, not to boast savings, but to expose what cash actually left the farm. Claire rebuilt her model from scratch, and Bo set one rule before she touched projected returns. Use 3 consecutive bad years, not 1. Then use the bad years in the first 3 years of debt, not in years 8 through 10 when principal had already fallen. She ran the Keen package under that sequence. Year 1, margin compression, but survivable. Year 2, yield pressure and basis weakness drove operating draw beyond planned limits. Year 3, partial recovery still failed to close the prior gap. The new term stack did not forgive timing. By month 19, unrestricted cash turned negative. By month 22, the model required additional borrowing, merely to keep commitments current. Family living at $68,400 per year turned from a footnote into a fault line. The spreadsheet did not lie, it just needed a harsher question. Bo flipped to another sheet and made her do slower arithmetic out loud. Annual debt service $412,900 divided by 12 months equals $34,408 due, regardless of rain, basis, or fertilizer shock. Add taxes and insurance overhead, near $14,900 on the home place, and fixed operational overhead already carried. Add living draw $5,700 per month. Add unavoidable maintenance, even on new equipment, because bearings, tires, and wear parts ignore optimism. Now, he said, show me the cash requirement before 1 bushel moves. She did. The answer sat there, plain and heavy. He did not criticize her schooling. In truth, he admired it. She had learned valuation, portfolio logic, and growth framing at a high level. What she had not been required to do was live through the order of losses. In farming, average outcomes often arrive late, and lenders bill early. He turned to a page he had never seen from 1987, when he bought 120 acres at $1,800 to $50 per acre after foreclosure in a federal sale. Purchase total $222,000. He had placed $88,000 down and structured the remainder so he could clear it in 34 months without refinancing. Then he showed the 1992 parcel, 160 acres at $2,400 per acre, $384,000 total, paid in 4 annual tranches, tied to grain inventories and stored cash, each payment scheduled only after projected worst-case gross margin still covered taxes and carry. Next came 2009, when panic sales let him buy at $4,900 per acre, while others froze. Each decision looked conservative in its own year. Across decades, conservative looked like acceleration. Claire reached for the folder labeled Liquidity and paused. Inside were Treasury ladder confirmations and money market statements, not as vanity balances, but as stored optionality. Tranches of $150,000, $200,000, and $250,000 maturing across rolling windows. Weighted yields between 4.8% and 5.2% in current terms. Total liquid reserve at that table date, $1,270,000. You kept this idle, she said, then corrected herself before he answered. Not idle. Dry powder. Bo nodded. Cash buys choices when other people lose them. That afternoon, he took her to the machine shed and turned the lesson physical. The 7720 combine did not look pretty, but every grease point had a date mark, every chain had measured stretch, logged in a binder, and the pre-harvest checklist was laminated and smudged from use. They inspected a bearing housing she wanted to postpone. Estimated part and labor, if done now, $420 and 1 hour 40 minutes. Estimated if failed during harvest under pressure, likely fan damage, downtime, emergency call-out, and cascading loss easily above $6,000, not counting field delay risk in a tight weather window. Deferred maintenance is borrowed trouble, he said. By early July, Claire was no longer arguing for debt as default. She was decomposing each proposed obligation into a survivability question. What is the mandatory payment? What is the worst decile margin? And how many months of no new credit runway exist if 2 things go wrong at once? They worked evenings at the same table, where Travis had laid out the glossy package. Now the pages looked different. Less color, better spine. She reviewed peers with empathy, not distance. Nate Ellison borrowed $1,940,000 at 6.9% in 2019 and lost 640 acres to foreclosure in 2024 after 2 poor years and rising carry. Carla Ruiz carried $780,000 machinery debt at 9.1% and liquidated her cow-calf herd to stop penalty compounding. Ben Hartley refinanced twice, ended with $2,260,000 total liabilities, then entered Chapter 12 to save what could be saved. Jonah Pike absorbed 2 variable resets and a 17-cent basis collapse that looked minor in isolation and lethal in sequence. None were foolish. All were working. All were vulnerable to timing once fixed obligations outran bad year capacity. Near sunset, Claire closed the laptop and spoke without defensiveness. They taught me how to make profitable plans. You are teaching me how not to die waiting for them. Bo gave a short nod, stood, and reached for his cap. There was still wheat to check before dark, and the truck with twine on the tailgate still had work in it. At the door, he added one more line, almost as an afterthought, but it carried the weight of the month they had just begun to map. "We are not trying to look big," he said. "We are trying to stay standing." Claire stood in the doorway a moment longer, then followed him out to the yard with a legal pad tucked under her arm. The truck sat where he had left it, rust darkened by evening damp, baling twine looped tight across the tailgate latch. He checked one rear tire with the toe of his boot, looked toward the west field, and then, without ceremony, handed her the key ring. "Tomorrow," he said. "You drive. We verify numbers where they were made." At first light, they started at the oldest parcel still in the family books, 40 acres rented in 1983 and later bought in 2 pieces. Beau parked by a drainage ditch and read from memory while Claire cross-checked parcel cards on her tablet. 80 acres, purchased in 1987 at $1,850 per acre, was the headline she already knew, but the discipline sat in the lines under it. Tile repair over 5 years, $41,600 total, paid from post-harvest surplus. Lime applications averaged $38 per acre in lean years and $62 in stronger years. No skipped soil tests after 1991. Yield trend on that ground moved from 121 bushels corn equivalent in the late 1980s to 187 by 2020, not through one big equipment loan, but through dozens of small, timed checks. Back at the table by noon, he opened a newer binder labeled 2008 to 2025. This was the period Claire respected most because the data density looked familiar to her training. Every page had 3 columns in Beau's block handwriting: mandatory outflow, controllable outflow, and optional deployment. She noticed he treated optional deployment as a privilege, never an entitlement. 2008. Gross farm receipts, $1,126,400. Operating expense, $742,900. Net, before tax, $383,500. Land purchase, none. Liquidity carried into winter, $312,000. 2009. Bought 160 acres at $4,900 per acre, total $784,000, paid $460,000 cash, and $324,000 from 2 harvest cycles, no refinance, ending liquidity $205,000. 2010, rebuilt liquidity to $418,000, replaced grain leg motor and dryer controls for $28,400, avoided full dryer replacement quoted at $146,000. 2011, cash rented additional 100 to 40 acres at $248 per acre. Total annual rent, $34,720, hedged 1/3 corn at $6.02. 2012 drought year. Corn yield 108 bushels per acre on owned ground, 101 on lighter rented ground. Crop insurance indemnity, $286,300. Net positive $94,700 after all costs because no term machinery debt. 2013, no land purchase, built reserve to $603,000, prepaid fertilizer on June dip, saving $71 per ton on 420 tons. Total savings, $29,820. 2014. Bought 120 acres from retiring neighbor at $6,200 per acre. Total $744,000. Split payment over 14 months from grain sales and reserve draw. Ending liquidity, $331,000. 2015. Average corn yield 196, soybeans 58, gross $1,487,000, total principal owed long-term $0. 2016, added 180 rented acres at blended $261 per acre. Annual rent, $46,980. Machinery capex only $39,600 used strip till bar plus repairs. 2017. Laddered treasuries, first time, $350,000 across 12, 24, and 36-month maturities. Weighted yield 2.1% then. 2018. Sold underused sprayer for $42,000, hired custom application on selected acres for $19,700, reduced maintenance burden and labor pinch. 2019. Land taxes, insurance, and household draw. Combined $83,900. Operating line open and closed within crop year. Interest paid $11,240. 2020. Pandemic supply strain. Parts inventory pre-ordered in winter. Avoided in-season premiums estimated $18,600. 2021. Did not chase record machinery prices. Reserve balance crossed $1,010,000 in September. 2022. Fertilizer hit $1,190 per ton. Total nutrient bill rose by $214,000 versus 2020, absorbed without term borrowing due reserve and staged purchasing. 2023, bought no major iron, put $96,400 into drainage and grain handling reliability, reduced field loss, and dryer bottlenecks. 2024 acquired 80 acres at estate sale for $10,400 per acre, total $832,000, paid cash from maturing treasuries and retained earnings. 2025, year-end owned acreage 1,140, rented acreage 620, liquidity $1,270,000 between money market and laddered bills. Personal net worth marked conservatively at $8,460,000 after deferred tax assumptions. Claire ran a second pass in silence, and then did the arithmetic another way, the way she would have presented in a boardroom. Over 17 years, average annual retained earnings after tax and family draw were lower than the top quartile expansion stories in her graduate case packets. But volatility of retained earnings was dramatically lower, and negative years did not force asset sales. The compounding engine was less glamorous and more durable. Buy productive land when pricing disconnects appear, keep fixed commitments below ugly year margins, protect optionality with liquid reserves that are boring until they become decisive. By the second week of July, she had converted his handwritten sequence into her own model and added a survivability score she called Month Zero Burden. The Keen package scored 61 on expected return and 22 on survivability. Bo's existing structure scored 44 on expected return and 89 on survivability. When she inserted clustered shocks, 2 bad crop years and 1 financing squeeze, expected return rankings barely mattered because only one structure stayed solvent without emergency refinancing. That afternoon, Travis returned with updated sheets and a sharpened pitch. He brought examples of 3 county farms that had modernized with financing and posted impressive top-line growth. Claire let him speak, then asked for fixed payment schedules under a 10% operating cost rise and a 15% revenue drop. Travis answered with market share language, then with confidence, then with impatience. He was good at momentum, less good at tails. Bo set a hand on Travis's packet and asked Claire directly, if you had to choose between looking larger this year and sleeping through 3 ugly years without asking permission from a lender? Which one would you call strength? Claire looked back at Travis's pages, then at her father's ledgers, and saw the human side of that question in the names she had entered into her own workbook. Nate Ellison had expanded in 2019, when corn was stable and credit felt manageable. He borrowed $1,940,000 at 6.9%, layered equipment notes on top, and took on 640 additional acres he believed scale would absorb. His projected annual debt service was $223,400 at origination. After resets and short-term carry, cash obligations pushed past $261,000. In 2024, after 2 margin-tight years, he could not renew on terms he could carry. Foreclosure took 640 acres. He still got up before dawn, still worked, still knew more about his ground than most consultants ever will. The numbers outran his runway. Carla Ruiz modernized her hay and cattle setup with $780,000 machinery debt at 9.1%, expecting labor savings and throughput gains to offset payments. Her monthly obligation landed near $9,900 before feed volatility. Then feed and fuel moved together, calf prices softened, and one wet spring delayed first cutting enough to push purchase feed higher. She liquidated a large portion of her cow-calf herd to prevent compounding penalties. She did not fail because she lacked effort. She got caught in a sequence she could not pause. Ben Hartley refinanced twice, trying to bridge weak seasons and hold acreage together for his family. Each refinance reduced immediate pressure and increased long-run fragility. Total liabilities reached $2,260,000 across land, machinery, and carry costs. Chapter 12 was not a strategy he wanted. It was the only legal room left to reorganize and keep any operation alive. Claire met him at the elevator one morning, and he spoke plainly. I did not borrow for toys. I borrowed to keep going. Jonah Pike looked safest on paper because his operation was efficient, and his hedging discipline was better than average. But he had variable exposure at the wrong moment. 2 rate resets lifted annual financing cost faster than planned. Then a 17-cent basis collapse hit cash price at delivery. 17 cents sounds minor in casual conversation. On 180,000 bushels, it strips $30,600 from expected cash in the same window obligations come due. He sold equipment, then leased back what he needed, then stepped out of independent production to work grain logistics for the cooperative while rebuilding reserves. Travis did not mock any of them. He also did not account for them with enough weight. In his examples, failure sat in a footnote category called operator variance. In Bo's and Claire's evolving framework, those stories were central data about sequencing risk in a cyclical business with biological and weather constraints. 3 days later, county rain reports started coming in short. Western Indiana entered a flash drought pattern by late July. Not a total crop failure, but the kind of fast stress that shrinks confidence week by week. Subsoil moisture dropped. Corn leaves rolled by early afternoon. Basis softened at the wrong time. Then corn futures slid to $3.74, while soybean meal jumped, squeezing livestock operators from both sides. At the same time, regional lenders tightened operating credit standards after rising delinquency in surrounding counties. Travis scheduled a dealer showcase anyway, bannered as Finance First Modernization. The lot looked like a catalog spread. High horsepower tractors polished, 2 new combines on risers, financing reps at folding tables with rate cards that started attractive and reset hard. Attendance was strong because everyone was searching for a way to stay competitive while margins narrowed. Beau and Claire walked the edge of the crowd without hurry. Her laptop stayed in the truck. She had a printed one-page stress sheet in her pocket with their current obligations, projected input needs, tax schedule, and liquidity ladder. No theater, just capacity. When operating credit tightened the following week, several neighbors were told renewals would require additional collateral margins or reduced limits. For farms carrying heavy fixed notes, that translated into immediate triage. Sell grain earlier than planned, delay repairs, stretch payables, and hope weather recovered. The pressure was not abstract. It showed up in posture, in shorter conversations, in pickup beds carrying parts that should have been replaced months earlier. Beau's structure did not make him immune to pain. Lower prices still hurt. Drought still cut yield potential. But the absence of large mandatory term payments changed the shape of the pain. Input bills could be paid. Taxes were covered. Family draw stayed stable at $68,400 annual. Operating notes remained seasonal and clearable at harvest under conservative yield assumptions. Liquidity covered 24 months of essential outflows without new long-term borrowing, exactly the threshold he had forced Claire to test. On the first Monday of August, she presented him a revised operating memo at the same oak table where this argument started. It had no growth slogans. It had 3 directives: preserve payment survivability, convert volatility into optional purchase windows, and protect community continuity when possible. Beau read it once, nodded, and signed the bottom as if it were any other field note. That evening, with heat still trapped in the machine shed rafters, they updated one more line in the ledger. Expansion package declined, holdback avoided, liquidity intact. Then they added a second line Claire wrote herself in careful block letters. The closest thing to a thesis either of them would ever frame like one. Profits matter. Sequence decides who keeps the farm. Profits matter. Sequence decides who keeps the farm. Claire set the pen down, and the kitchen stayed quiet long enough for the refrigerator motor to cycle on and off. Then the landline rang. Beau answered, listened, and wrote 3 numbers on the margin of her memo. Cause number, lot date, deposit deadline. A court-supervised liquidation in Covington had moved up after a lender objection and a failed private sale. Equipment and land would be sold together unless bidders separated lots fast enough. Settlement required same-day funds, no financing contingencies, no extension language. By Tuesday morning, they were parked behind the courthouse annex with 32 other trucks and 2 dealership trailers. Travis Keene stood near the registration table in a pressed shirt, speaking to a cluster of operators about bridge financing and temporary leverage for permanent market position. He noticed Claire first, then Beau, then the same Chevrolet with Twine holding the tailgate closed. His expression did not change, but his voice rose half a step, as if the audience needed reinforcement. The trustee opened bidding with legal cadence and no emotion. Lot 1, 2-year-old combine, inspected and running, minimum reserve met at $240,000, then climbed to $278,000 installed. Lot 2, 2 grain carts and transfer augers, opened at $38,000, paused at $61,000. Lot 3, 160-acre tract with drainage litigation attached, delinquent taxes recorded, buyer assumes remediation escrow. A few people who had come for land stepped back once the clerk read the tile assessment figures into the microphone. Travis moved through the crowd with a folder of term sheets, whispering payment estimates and fast approvals. Two bidders raised paddles after speaking with him, both conditional. The trustee rejected both when underwriting calls came back incomplete. The lot went cold under full sun, shoes grinding gravel, everyone doing the same math in their heads. Yields uncertain, prices weak, credit tighter by the week. Bo lifted his card once for each lot. Never fast, never theatrical. $286,000 on the combine, $62,000 on carts and augers, $138,000 on the 160 acres with the drainage burden attached. Total hammer price, $486,000. The trustee asked for settlement confirmation within 1 hour per court order. A few people turned to watch him walk toward the cashier desk, because this was the part where most bids died. Travis followed close enough to be heard. Cash buyers are small thinkers in a scaling market. Bo did not answer him. He handed the clerk a cashier check from Benton Community Bank for $486,000 and a second envelope acknowledging the court-filed remediation escrow obligation, $187,000 due in staged releases after engineering sign-off. The clerk checked routing, called the bank, and then asked for proof the escrow would be met without borrowing because the judge had added that condition after prior defaults in the same case. Claire slid over a one-page liquidity letter on bank letterhead. Money market and treasury ladder balances available within 30 days, $1,318,442. Long-term machinery debt, $0. Real estate term debt, $0. She did not embellish. She did not smile. The reaction was not loud. That was what made it sharper. Shoulders changed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. One older operator near the fence gave a small nod and looked at Bo's truck, as if seeing it for the first time. Travis asked to see the letter, and Claire passed him a copy she had printed for the trustee packet. At the bottom, under personal guarantee capacity, sat the conservative net worth line already reconciled to land comps and deferred tax assumptions. $8,460,000. He read it twice. You have been sitting on this. Bo adjusted his cap. We have been building it. Let me stop here and ask you something. When conditions turn against everyone at once, do you want the neighbor with the brightest brochure or the one whose payments still clear in silence? By Thursday afternoon, calls started coming in before the ink dried on the sale order. Nate Ellison asked if the combine would be custom booked, because his current machine had a hydrostatic issue he could not fund until after harvest. Carla Ruiz asked whether Bo knew of a used baler in decent condition that did not require dealer financing. Ben Hartley asked for an hour at the table. No promises, just arithmetic. Jonah Pike asked nothing for himself. He called to warn that 2 input suppliers had shortened terms, and people were about to get squeezed on timing again. Claire put every request into one worksheet with 5 columns Bo had used for decades, and she now made digital. Purpose, mandatory payment, worst decile margin, collateral reality, and runway months without new credit. Bo added a 6th by hand, character evidence, meaning attendance, effort, and whether the operator had started cutting fixed lifestyle costs before asking anyone else to carry risk. They met that evening at the oak table in pairs, then all together after sunset. Bo made the same statement to each one. No charity theater. We do this so you stay in the game. Claire explained terms in plain numbers and let people decline without pressure. They would create Sutton Bridge Fund at $2 million initial capitalization from farm retained earnings and maturing treasuries. Instruments would be simple. 0 interest notes up to 5 years for essential equipment, 12 to 18-month operating bridges, when cash conversion timing was the only failure point, no compounding penalties, and immediate restructuring if weather or basis shocks hit documented triggers. In exchange, every recipient would submit monthly cash flow reports and agree to help another operator review stress tests once stable. Nate went first. He needed reliability, not horsepower. Approved package: $184,000, zero interest over 60 months for a used planter, a rebuilt grain truck engine, and seasonal combine access deposit. Payment $3,066.67 per month. Additional operating bridge, $36,000 for input timing. 12 months, interest zero, balloon prohibited, equal monthly repayment $3,000 after a 2-month grace. Total commitment $220,000. His projected break-even at current rent and conservative yield assumptions sat at 3.96 corn equivalent. With the bridge and no high-rate carry, he could remain current even if cash corn stayed under $4 through harvest. Carla's plan was smaller and tighter. She had already made the hard cut by liquidating most of the herd before penalties buried her. She needed hay capacity she could own, not lease at panic rates. Approved note: $92,400 over 60 months for a used baler, rake, and fence rehabilitation materials. Payment $1,540 per month. First payment deferred 90 days to align with sales cycle. Operating bridge $18,000 for feed transition and veterinary essentials. 12-month amortization at $1,500 per month. Total commitment $110,400. Her rebuilt herd target was 84 cows, with feed cost assumptions set 10% above current quotes to avoid optimistic budgeting. Ben came in with the heaviest file and the least room for error. He had exited legal supervision, but still carried bruises from 2 refinances that solved one season and damaged the next 5. He asked for more than Bo was willing to extend, unsecured. They decomposed it line by line until request and capacity matched. Approved package, $268,000, zero interest, 60 months, secured by paid-for equipment and crop assignment. Payment $4,466.67 per month. Purpose was to replace 2 unreliable units and prepay critical repairs before breakdown season. No operating bridge until he posted 2 quarters of on-time reports. He accepted without argument because the payment fit his ugly year margin and did not depend on perfect weather. Jonah did not ask to return to independent production immediately. He asked for a runway to rebuild savings while he managed grain logistics for the cooperative and prepared a lower-risk reentry. Claire designed a hybrid note, $54,000 over 36 months to acquire a used tender setup and limited storage rights with a partner, payment $1,500 monthly, tied to documented contract income rather than speculative yield. A second conditional line, up to $25,000, would activate only after 12 consecutive months of positive free cash flow. He said yes, then sat for a full minute without speaking, hands flat on the table, before thanking them once. If you are learning something from this, pay attention to the pattern. Every dollar was attached to survivable payments first, growth second. By the 3rd week of August, Claire had closed legal formation for Sutton Bridge Fund and built a reporting cadence stricter than most bank renewals. Total committed in round 1, $652,400. Uncommitted reserve, $1,347,600. She set liquidity floors inside the fund itself because she had learned the same lesson at a different scale. If a bridge cannot survive clustered stress, it is only delayed collapse. Minimum reserve threshold was fixed at $900,000 untouched except by unanimous written decision from both trustees. She also required a 24-month stress workbook from every new applicant, with prices, yields, and input shocks entered in adverse sequence, not average sequence. Then she ran the deeper examination she had wanted from the beginning, now with lived inputs rather than classroom assumptions. First, she recalculated the liquidation purchase versus replacement economics. Combine and grain cart package, replacement cost, in current dealer quotes, $816,000. Distressed acquisition price, $348,000 for those units, 42.6% of replacement. The 160-acre tract carried $187,000 remediation escrow, so effective basis became $325,000. Even with another $74,000 projected tile and legal cleanup over 2 years, all-in basis would be $399,000. If remediated productivity reached only 72% of county average, conservative appraised value still penciled at $560,000, creating embedded equity without leverage and without forced payment risk during the repair window. Second, she compared debt service drag avoided by declining the Keene package. Proposed annual term debt service had been $412,900. Their chosen path added $0 mandatory term service. Even after cash purchases and escrow commitments, farm-level liquidity remained above $900,000, enough to cover 2 years of core inputs, taxes, insurance, and family draw under adverse pricing. She modeled 3 consecutive bad years again, with debt package, unrestricted cash, turned negative by month 19, with debt-light structure and controlled capital deployment. Unrestricted cash stayed positive through month 36, though tight in months 14 through 21. The difference was not style, it was solvency. Third, she quantified community multiplier effects from the first 4 bridge fund notes. Aggregate acres directly stabilized or reactivated. 904 between Nate, Carla feed acres, Ben lease blocks, and Jonah's contracted logistics support. Estimated local spend retained that would otherwise leak through distress sales and penalty financing. $1,184,000 over 2 crop cycles. Projected default probability under their stress assumptions, 7.8% weighted versus 23.4% for comparable high-rate short-term products currently being offered in the county. At 0 interest, fund return was not financial yield. Return was prevented liquidation, preserved productive capacity, and time bought for competent operators to recover. She printed the analysis, set it beside the handwritten ledger, and watched Bo read every line without interruption. Near midnight, he reached for his pen and added 1 sentence at the bottom in the same block letters he had used for 40 years, a line that matched her model and his life at once. Liquidity beats image when cycles turn, and generosity works best when the math can survive the weather. Claire underlined that sentence once, then opened a new page and wrote the first reporting date. September 3rd, 2026. 6 in the morning, Sutton office, coffee on the stove, cash flow packets due in hard copy, and digital file. No one missed. Nate arrived first with dust on his boots and a notebook that looked as worn as Bo's earliest ledgers. His 220 rented acres were spread across 3 landlords, and the danger was timing, not laziness. Rent hit in 2 blocks, inputs in 1 block, grain checks in another, and every gap invited expensive short-term credit. Claire and Bo reworked his calendar so his $3,066.67 equipment note and $3,000 operating bridge payment landed 2 weeks after expected settlement dates, not before. It sounded small. It changed his year. By harvest close, his average corn yield was 164 bushels, soybeans 49, and gross revenue reached $286,400 on conservative pricing. He finished year one with all 12 payments current, $19,300 in rebuilt working capital, and no penalty interest paid to anyone. By mid-December, Carla brought in a different kind of report. Handwritten feed ratios beside printed vet bills. She had rebuilt to 84 cows exactly, not 85 because her winter forage math only covered 84 with a margin. The used baler held through second cutting after one $680 bearing repair and one $240 hydraulic hose replacement. Both planned, both paid, same week. Her 5-year zero-interest payment of $1,540 started after the 90-day deferral and cleared every month through auto transfer. She asked Claire to set up so she would never drift and explain later. Her feed transition bridge of $18,000 amortized on schedule. And by spring, she had reduced purchased feed by 22% against her prior year baseline. The gain was not dramatic from the road. It was stable from the ledger. Ben took the hardest path because he had the least room for narrative comfort. He sent every quarter report before deadline, including the ugly lines, especially the ugly lines. The first 2 quarters proved discipline, and Claire released a tightly capped seasonal input bridge with monthly review checkpoints instead of annual review. He did not miss one. By the second week of June 2027, he had leased 300 acres at rates he could carry under bad year assumptions, not best year hope, and his $4,466.67 payment remained current without rolling obligations forward. When the court letter arrived confirming he had fully exited bankruptcy supervision, he did not frame it. He folded it into his binder behind soil test records and lease maps, exactly where a practical man stores hard-won freedom. Jonah stayed with the cooperative by design, and that decision protected him. His logistics role gave him steady income, while he rebuilt reserves and relearned risk from the side of the scale house instead of the edge of insolvency. The $1,500 monthly payment on his tender and storage rights note never slipped. 12 months of positive free cash flow triggered his conditional line, but he drew only $11,200 of the available $25,000 and left the rest untouched, saying he wanted to grow his own buffer before borrowing even at zero interest. By March 2028, his personal savings passed $74,000, and he signed a modest share farming agreement that did not require new term debt. He still managed grain logistics full-time because predictable cash flow was now part of his strategy, not a badge of defeat. 3 days after the first anniversary of the fund, Claire ran the multiplier analysis again with realized data instead of projections. Round one commitments had been $652,400. Additional commitments, all stress-tested and approved under the same rules, brought total deployed capital to $1,184,000 across 9 operators, including the original 4 and 5 smaller equipment bridge loans under $120,000 each. Weighted on-time payment rate stood at 98.7%. One borrower required a 3-month restructuring after a storm-damaged stand, and the restructuring was executed without fees, as promised. Directly stabilized acreage reached 2,740 across owned, rented, and contract-supported ground. At a conservative blended land value of $11,200 per acre for owned equivalent productive capacity in their market, the stabilized productive base represented $688,000 that stayed active rather than sliding toward forced liquidation channels. The community effect was measurable in Plain County terms. Distress auction volume in their immediate trade radius fell for 2 consecutive seasons, not because bad weather vanished, but because fewer operators were cornered into panic sales at the wrong week. Local repair shops saw winter maintenance spend recover. Input suppliers received earlier, cleaner payment schedules from fund participants because cash calendars were built to match reality. Even the cooperative's basis management improved at the margin because emergency grain dumping at first bid softened. One disciplined pool of farmers did not transform agriculture, but it altered outcomes inside a small geography where timing had been destroying people, one payment cycle at a time. By late January 2028, Travis Keene's high-leverage program was no longer defensible on its own numbers. 2 weak years had pushed delinquency above internal tolerance, and too many deals depended on refinancing assumptions that no longer cleared underwriting. He did not lose his career. He lost the sales doctrine. The dealership closed that specific program, wrote down a portion of expected finance margin income, and shifted inventory strategy toward late-model used equipment with verified service histories and plain-language risk disclosures. Travis remained with the dealership, though his role changed from pressure closer to used equipment specialist. The first months were awkward because people remembered his confidence when credit was easy. To his credit, he stopped pretending the old language still worked. He began bringing payment risk sheets to kitchen tables that included 3 scenario stress lines, not only base case optimism. He told buyers what their monthly obligation would be at current rates and what it could become after resets. Some still walked away. He let them walk. At the winter clinic in Remington, attendance around 200, Travis took the microphone after a crop insurance speaker and before the lender panel. He read from notes for the first minute, then looked up and said the sentence he had once dismissed when Bo said it at his own table. Liquidity beats image when cycles turn. No applause break, no drama. Just a quiet room and several heads nodding because everyone there had paid tuition to the same lesson, one way or another. Bo did not attend that clinic. He was in a machine shed replacing feeder house chain guides with Claire and 2 part-time hands before a forecasted freeze. But Travis sent him a 1-paragraph letter afterward, plain paper, no logo, acknowledging he had pushed leverage too hard and thanking the Suttons for forcing a harder conversation in public. Bo read it once and filed it in a drawer marked Dealer and Bank Correspondence 2028. Resolved, not celebrated. By the first week of April 2028, the 160-acre tract from the court sale had crossed from burden to asset. Engineering sign-off cleared the drainage remediation in phases, escrow releases were documented, and total cleanup landed at $69,400 beyond the original escrow rather than the $74,000 high-side projection. First full-season yields were uneven but improving, exactly as Claire modeled. The all-in basis stayed below local comparable value, and because there was no term debt tied to the parcel, they could let agronomy improvements compound without payment pressure dictating bad decisions. Roll call mattered to Claire now in the same way it had always mattered to Bo. No names left floating, no story without outcomes. Bo Sutton, 74 by then, still rose before sunrise, still drove the 1996 Chevrolet C2500, now showing 319,800 miles, still tied the tailgate with baling twine when the latch acted up in wet weather. Claire Sutton, chief operator by every practical measure, ran stress testing, lender packets, and field plans side by side, and trained younger operators in a workshop she called Sequence Over Averages. Nate Ellison farmed 220 rented acres and finished his second year fully current, with working capital above $41,000 and no delinquent payables. Carla Ruiz held at 84 cows, paid down principal exactly on schedule, and added 12 acres of improved hay ground through a lease she could sustain under low-price assumptions. Ben Hartley leased 300 acres, remained out-of-court supervision, and built a 6-month input reserve before discussing any expansion. Jonah Pike managed grain logistics for the cooperative, maintained his payment record, and re-entered production gradually, with contracted acres only, keeping a wage income as ballast. Travis Keene stayed in business, no longer as the county evangelist of leverage, now as a seller of used machinery who put downside arithmetic in front of upside talk. He had not become sentimental. He had become careful. In a cyclical county, that counted. The equipment had its own roll call because on farms, tools carry memory and policy at once. The auction combine, bought for $286,000, cleared 2 harvests with planned maintenance and one $3,900 preseason repair. The grain carts and augers purchased for $62,000 handled higher throughput than their conservative estimate. The older machines did not disappear either. The 7720 remained backup and specialty unit, maintained, logged, and used when timing demanded redundancy over appearance. The shed binders thickened. The philosophy stayed operational. If you want more stories where arithmetic, not image, decides who keeps the land, subscribe and stay with this channel. If the story sounded like your county, comment with the payment threshold you believe a farm should never cross under bad year margins. Share this with one person who looks ordinary from the road but quietly carries a community when the cycle turns. On a cool October morning, after scale tickets were printed and filed, Bo and Claire pulled out of Fowler Grain and Feed in the same rusted truck, tailgate tied, coffee in paper cups, ledger and laptop on the bench seat between them. The bins were not full enough to brag about, not empty enough to fear, and every mandatory payment on their books could clear under numbers they did not need to guess at. That was the whole lesson the degree had missed, and the farm had taught in full. Wealth is what survives bad sequence, compounds without applause, and then leaves enough room to keep other people on their ground. Claire kept her eyes on the road another mile, then reached for the legal pad at her feet and added one more instruction beneath the line she had just written. Annual review must happen in person, with the ledgers open, no exceptions. Bo glanced at it, gave a small nod, and turned toward the county lane that led home, where the oak table was already waiting with 5 folders stacked in order of risk. On November 6th, 2028, they held the first full Bridge Fund performance hearing in the machine shed office because the house table could not fit everyone and their paperwork. A torpedo heater clicked in the corner. Coffee steamed into paper cups. Each borrower sat with their own binder, and Claire projected one sheet at a time on the white wall. Original note, revised terms if any, current balance, payment history, cash runway, and next season's stress test. Nate went first because he had called first in crisis and insisted on being judged first in review. He laid out 12 deposit slips and 12 transfer confirmations in a neat row. Principal outstanding on his combined notes had fallen from $220,000 to $163,200. He had not missed a payment. He had not requested deferral. He had rebuilt enough working capital to prepay seed discounts on 140 of his 220 rented acres, saving $6,380 compared with prior spring pricing. Then he said the part that mattered most to Bo. I stopped treating timing gaps like bad luck. I treat them like design flaws now. His 2028 cash flow stress workbook, run at $3.70 corn and 12% higher nitrogen, still stayed positive by month 16 because his fixed obligations were capped before the season began. Carla set her binder down with the feed chart tucked inside. Her $110,400 package was down to $78,960 outstanding. The baler had required one spindle rebuild at $1,140 and routine knotter parts at $312, both paid from operating cash. No new note. She had held the herd at 84 cows through 2 volatile feed windows and put up enough hay to sell a small surplus instead of buying emergency bales in late winter. She handed Claire a 1-page sheet with 3 columns she had copied from Beau's old format. Mandatory, controllable, optional. I finally know which bills can shout and which bills can wait. Her runway had moved from 6 weeks to 5 months. Ben arrived with the thickest packet again, but it no longer carried court notices on top. He had reduced his bridge principal from $268,000 to $201,000, remained current every month, and met the 2-quarter requirement that had unlocked a limited seasonal line. He had drawn $42,000 from that line, repaid $31,500 before year-end, and left the remainder scheduled against contracted grain delivery rather than hope pricing. On his stress test, he circled one line in red, machinery replacement temptation. I wrote no beside it, he said. No is cheaper than regret. Beau almost smiled at that. Jonah came last, as usual, and placed his cooperative payroll summaries beside his note ledger. He had paid his $54,000 note down to $24,000, drawn only $11,200 of his conditional line, and repaid that draw in full before touching the next season. His savings had crossed $103,000. He still worked grain logistics full-time, and his share farming acres stayed capped at a level his wage income could subsidize without strain. He told the room he had turned down 180 additional acres in July because the lease required front-loaded rent and assumed average yields. I would rather sleep, he said quietly. By the second week of that November, Claire finalized year 2 numbers for all 9 funded operators and read them aloud before anyone left. Total deployed since launch, $1,184,000. Total repaid to date, $472,640. Delinquency over 30 days, 0. Restructures executed, 1. Completed and back on schedule. Stabilized and reactivated acreage, 2,740. Weighted break-even improvement versus each borrower's pre-fund structure, 18.4%. Estimated distress sales prevented in their trade radius, based on trustee filings and lender notices. 11 pieces of essential equipment and 3 partial land dispositions that did not occur. Local machine shop invoices among participants rose 27% year over year, which meant maintenance was happening in winter instead of breakdown purchases in harvest. The math did not clap. It simply held. Before they adjourned, Beau opened a flat archive box and pulled out artifacts that had started the whole fight. Travis's 40-page expansion packet, the non-refundable holdback term with the $75,000 deadline, the trustee receipt for the $486,000 cashier check, the remediation escrow releases, and the liquidity letter the clerk had verified by phone. He passed each document around once, then gave them to Claire. Your records now. She labeled a new binder Bridge Origin, indexed every page, and scanned copies to 2 drives. Physical evidence accounted for. Digital backups complete. In January 2029, the winter clinic at Remington filled again, and Travis stood in front of a room that now watched his numbers before his jacket. He did not run from the past. He opened with his own reconciliation. High-leverage program charge-offs had forced a policy rewrite. 2 years of weak recoveries had erased the commission premium that strategy once promised. Used equipment gross margins were lower per unit, but default-adjusted returns were stronger once repossession and legal costs were counted. He showed a simple comparison on the projector. Old model average finance package, $612,000. Delinquency-adjusted net contribution, 3.1%. New model average package, $214,000 used units with documented service history, transparent stress sheet attached. Delinquency-adjusted net contribution, 5.4%. I sold image, he said. Now I sell survivable payments. After the session, he walked to the back row where Claire and Beau were gathering papers. He handed Beau a signed copy of the new payment risk worksheet his dealership now required on every financed quote. Base case, bad year, and clustered bad years with rate reset sensitivity. I should have done this earlier. Beau read it, folded it once, and put it in the same folder as the old letter, resolved twice, kept for memory, not leverage. 3 days later, Claire received the only callback that had remained open in her own mind. The unnamed older operator who had nodded at the courthouse fence during the liquidation called the office line. He introduced himself as Dale Mercer, said he had watched Beau settle cash that day, and admitted he had laughed at the truck before he saw the receipt clear. He asked if he could sit in on a stress test workshop, not to borrow, just to learn. Claire told him yes, and he attended every month that winter. By April 2030, the farm's roll call fit on one whiteboard and still took 2 hours to read because every name now had numbers beside it. Beau Sutton, 76, still active, still driving the 1996 Chevrolet, now at 327,412 miles. Rust worse, engine sound steady, tailgate twine replaced twice a year. Claire Sutton, chief operator and co-trustee, running 1,140 owned acres and 620 rented with zero long-term machinery. Debt and liquidity never below the internal $900,000 floor since fund launch. Nate Ellison, current, 220 rented acres, working capital above $58,000, no delinquent payables. Carla Ruiz, current, 84 cows maintained, hay inventory buffer restored, principal reduction ahead of schedule by 2 months. Ben Hartley, current, 300 leased acres, reserve equal to 6 months of inputs, no court supervision. Jonah Pike, current, cooperative logistics manager plus controlled share farming block, savings above $120,000, conditional line untouched for 11 months. Travis Keene, employed, high-leverage program closed permanently, used equipment portfolio stable, risk sheets mandatory. The equipment roll call followed. Auction combine at 2,100 feet, 46 separator hours under Sutton ownership, planned repairs logged, no catastrophic in-season failure. Grain carts and augers purchased with it still in service. Legacy 7720 still maintained as backup. Used 63 hours the previous harvest, during a weather squeeze that would have forced costly custom work without redundancy. The once burdened 160-acre tract now produced within 91% of county average after drainage remediation, and all escrow documents were closed and filed with the county recorder. Every physical thread that began as risk had an endpoint in ink. On a clear October morning in 2031, The line at Fowler Grain and Feed stretched past the fertilizer tanks again, almost a mirror of the day this started. Bo parked last in the same truck. Claire stepped out on the passenger side with a laptop and a paper ledger tucked under her arm. A young operator waiting at the scale asked her, half joking and half serious, whether she had a shortcut for getting bigger fast. She looked at the rust, the twine, the coffee bought in coins, and then at her father checking a tire with his boot. Wrong target, she said. Get harder to kill first. She showed him one page, no speech, just 3 lines in black ink. Fixed payments below ugly year margin, 24 months of essential runway, growth only after both hold. He read it, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket as if it were a parts list he would need by afternoon. Bo climbed back in, waited for the scale light to turn, and eased the truck forward. No one laughed this time. No one needed to. The farm still operated. The notes still cleared. The people they helped were still on their land. Wealth, in the only form that kept proving itself, looked like an old pickup, a disciplined ledger, and enough surplus strength to steady someone else when the cycle turned.